And with that, I will introduce our featured speaker. He is one of our most popular guests from last year. Actually, he came and spoke to us before, and everybody seemed really interested in what he had to say. He is a freelance author and a journalist, and he has been published in many publications, including, I think, The Atlantic, The Nation, and many others. I don't have the list right in front of me. But, please welcome Sasha Abramsky.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you all for inviting me back here again. And I can't honestly remember what I talked about last time, so I hope I'm not second-guessing myself. Part of the problem with a news cycle like the one we're living through at the moment is it makes it almost impossible to plan a speech in advance. Which means that I've been spending much of today trying to work out how to sort of ad-lib my way through the next half an hour. So, here goes. I don't need to tell you, because everybody in the universe knows it at this point, that we're in the middle of an impeachment inquiry. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing for all kinds of reasons. But the reason for the impeachment inquiry is actually fairly narrow. The reason for the impeachment inquiry is that Donald Trump got caught, pretty much red-handed, illegally soliciting a foreign leader to provide election year help for him by digging up dirt against a political rival. And that breaks all kinds of rules. It breaks campaign finance rules. It breaks constitutional clauses saying you can't finagle foreign governments to intervene in domestic politics. And it puts Trump in this extraordinarily vulnerable position where it's fairly certain that the House will impeach him. And this will be only the third time in American history that a president has been impeached. You had Andrew Johnson. Richard Nixon was not impeached. He chose to resign beforehand. And then you had Bill Clinton, who was impeached, but on an issue that the public never got on board with. So this is only really the second or third time that there's going to be an impeachment inquiry that the public is fully on board with, and if the opinion polls, including Fox News, are to be believed, a majority now supports. So that's the sort of pragmatic news of the day. But beyond the fact that Trump happened to be caught red-handed on this single phone call, there's actually a moral reason for impeachment and a moral reason for removal from office that goes far beyond one single rancid telephone call. And the reason for that impeachment necessity is the increasingly sadistic, cruel, irrational, bullying behavior, not just of Donald Trump, but of the entire administration that he presides over. And this is particularly the case, though not exclusively the case, vis-a-vis immigrants. When Trump came into office, a lot of my friends said, well, he actually doesn't care about anything except for money. And I've done a lot of reporting in the caucuses and the primaries and the general election, and it seemed to me that the one thing that Trump actually did care about, in addition to money, was white nationalism. He was a dyed-in-the-wool white nationalist. He was a man who could not help himself. If there was a racist comment to be made, he would find a way to make it. If there was a racial alliance to be made with the most unsavory white nationalist characters, he'd find a way to make that alliance or to find a way not to disavow that alliance. And you've seen this now for 3 awful years throughout his presidency, that every single immigrant group that he can go after, he does go after. And that goes for whether we're talking about DACA and the hundreds of thousands of young Americans who are now vulnerable to deportation if the Supreme Court sides with Trump on DACA. It goes for temporary protected status and the hundreds of thousands of people who were here legally under temporary protected status and who Trump has tried to deport. And he hasn't succeeded yet, only because the courts have intervened. It goes for refugees. Year in, year out, he slashed the number of people admitted, down from 110,000 as a projected target in 2017 to 18,000 next year as a cap. He has demonized asylum seekers and bottled them up in awful camps, south of the border, or made them live for weeks on end in tents, in puddles, along the entry bridges that connect Mexico and the United States. He has set HUD to work to find a methodology to evict 100,000 people, including 55,000 citizen children who are members of mixed status families. He has tried, and the courts last week resisted him again on this, but he has tried to dramatically rewrite American immigration policy, not through congressional legislation, but through public charge. And for those of you who don't know what public charge does, he's basically expanded the definition of who is likely to be a ward of the state and therefore eligible either for deportation or denial of entry to include anybody who uses not just cash public assistance, but food stamps, Medicaid, housing assistance, and an array of other basic parts of the safety net. Most recently, by proclamation. Didn't think we had proclamations in a democracy, but apparently we do. Hear me, oh hear me. By royal proclamation, Trump declared last week that any immigrant who could not prove they would have private health insurance within a month of arrival would be deported if they were already here or denied entry if they were trying to come in. Now, this is the same man who has spent the last 3 years trying to overturn the Affordable Care Act that mandates that Americans have health coverage. But apparently there's one rule for immigrants and another rule for poor Americans. So all of these reasons should, in and of themselves, be cause to remove this man from office. Because he has made no effort to create a government that speaks for the people. He has made an effort to create and implement governance for a narrow sliver of white nationalists within this country. And if anyone's in any doubt as to the venom behind this man's thinking, one only needs to read reports, and there are a lot of reports starting to come out because everybody is now deciding to talk to the press. One only needs to read reports about the meeting that he had with Kirstjen Nielsen, who was then the Department of Homeland Security Secretary, and other top border officials last March, in which he first of all berated his Homeland Security staff and urged them to allow immigrants to be shot in the legs, either by the army or by Border Patrol, then urged them to do a cost analysis of how they could create an impaling mechanism on top of his wall so that if people climbed the wall they would be impaled, and finally asked his staff why he couldn't have a moat filled with alligators to eat immigrants. Now, in a rational world, if you were the Secretary for Homeland Security and you heard your Commander-in-Chief say, I want a 2,000-mile-long alligator moat, you would probably alert everybody you could that we needed to implement the 25th Amendment. In our world, according to the New York Times, his officials promptly costed it out to see if it was feasible. Which I think in and of itself says how degraded governance has become in the Trump era. But let's briefly go beyond immigration. Other reasons that Trump has no business being near power. For the last 3 years, out of an obsessive, a compulsive need to dismantle anything and everything that Obama created, he has tried to dismantle the Affordable Care Act. And right now, the Department of Justice is siding with this Hail Mary lawsuit designed to render the entire thing unconstitutional, with no alternatives in place in case the Supreme Court actually does render it unconstitutional. Imagine that. To spite the previous precedent, he's willing to go out on a limb to try to get the Supreme Court to dismantle an insurance infrastructure that is keeping tens of millions of people with affordable health insurance. And he's willing to do it with no backstop in place. It will create economic and social and healthcare mayhem if that lawsuit succeeds. Moving on from there, he has taken an environmental wrecking ball, a wrecking ball to environmental policy, to workplace safety regulations, to banking structures, to consumer protection institutions, and he has done so again, by and large, simply to erase the legacy of his predecessor. There's no strategic thinking other than a vaguely Republican idea that regulations as a sort of be-all are bad. But more to the point, he has just decided that if he can eradicate any institution created during the Obama years or any regulation put in place during the Obama years, he will. Even if it makes people sicker, even if it makes communities dirtier, even if it makes millions of people more likely to go into bankruptcy if they develop a sickness. He has used the Department of Justice and the Environmental Protection Agency, among other agencies, as political weapons to go after his enemies. And we saw that most recently with letters sent to cities in California and to the state of California itself over homelessness. Now, homelessness is awful. You just need to walk down the street in Sacramento. We know it's a huge problem. Nobody in California is sitting there saying, we love having 100,000 people living on the streets. We think it's really good that we have tent encampments under every overpass. Nobody's saying that. What we're saying is we need money. We need resources. We need help here. We need more access to drug treatment services. We need more mental health systems. We need more affordable housing. We need more public housing. Now, some of that can be delivered at the city or the state level, but an awful lot of that takes federal effort and federal intervention, even for a state as big and as wealthy and as dynamic as California. Trump came to California. He didn't have any solutions to actually deal with the homelessness crisis. He just sent out a few tweets basically promising roundups of the homeless population. Not to help the homeless, but because they were quote-unquote nuisances and eyesores to the business community. Now, in normal circumstances, again, this kind of lack of empathy, this kind of systemic cruelty, the irrationality, all of it would be cause to give people serious doubt as to whether this man has the temperament, the capability to stay in office. But Trump's surrounded by a cult of the personality. It's an extraordinarily destructive cult of the personality. He said during the election, I could go onto Fifth Avenue, I could shoot someone in public, my supporters would still stay with me. We kind of thought he was hyperbolic at the time. This is not really hyperbolic. Basically, he has degraded and destroyed and corroded, he has bullied and he has blustered, he's insulted and he's humiliated, and the cult of the personality for 3 years has stayed intact. But here's the thing, coming back to the beginning, to the whole impeachment inquiry. Over the last 3 weeks, that cult has started to break down. And I've always thought, and I sort of feel this partly because my grandparents in the 1950s in England were deeply committed to Stalinism, to their horror afterwards. Once that cult of the personality broke down in the mid-1950s, my grandparents spent the rest of their lives second-guessing themselves about how they could have possibly bought into something as horrific as the Stalin cult of the personality. And all of their friends in the Communist Party who left felt the same thing. And I've always thought that when cults of the personality break, they break spectacularly. They don't gradually diminish, but something happens, whether it's Hungary in 1956 or whether it's what we're seeing today. And when that cult of the personality breaks down, it splinters into a million pieces and can never be resurrected. And I think we're starting to see that with the impeachment inquiry. The first thing that's happened is the culture of impunity is gone. All of those career professionals who were in the background and they were sort of thinking to themselves, we just got to keep our heads down and we've got to go with the flow here and we've got to find some way to make Trumpism work. Now they're coming out and they're saying, there's no way this project works, this project is crazy. And they're using words like crazy. And they're bearing their secrets. They're telling what's going on behind the scenes. And they're telling it to anyone who will listen. They're telling it to congressional investigators. They're telling it to lawyers. They're telling it to the FBI. They're telling it to journalists. They're telling it on Twitter to the broader public. But every hour, stories are coming out, not just about the dysfunctionality of this administration, but about the cruelty and about the fundamental irrationality. And we're seeing transcripts of phone calls that make no sense. And we're seeing webs of corruption being exposed. What's happening with Giuliani and his cohort, his accomplices. we're seeing this notion being put out there in public that Trump is basically running a protection racket from the White House.
Yeah.
A pay-to-play protection racket. Hey, you want us to protect you? Sure. Give us some money, give us some dirt. And it's becoming ever harder to defend him. You're not really seeing the Republican Party try to defend him anymore. They're trying to throw up noise and fog and distraction. They're trying to say the process is wrong. They're trying to say the impeachment inquiry is a witch hunt. But what they're not doing is saying, you know what? We think it's a really good idea to solicit the Ukraine and China in public to undermine elections. Nobody's saying that. Even Lindsey Graham's not saying that. You know, that's saying something. And as that happens, you see these really dramatic public opinion shifts. And the most obvious of those is the support numbers for impeachment. One poll after another, including Fox News, to Trump's incandescent fury, has shown now that a majority of Americans support not just the impeachment inquiry, but removing him from office. And this is why the unthinkable becomes thinkable. If Donald Trump is opposed by 50 or 51%, it's possible McConnell will be able to hold the line in the Senate. If Donald Trump is opposed by 60, 65, or 70%, which could happen as these allegations spiral, it is going to become increasingly difficult and increasingly politically counterproductive for McConnell to hold the line. Now, the thing is, Trump's not doing himself any favors here. Let's move on to Syria and to the Kurds. Because now what we're seeing is not just criminality. That's almost par for the course. We've gotten used to criminality with Trump. What we're seeing now is utter insanity dressed up as public policy. So, if any of you remember Leonid Brezhnev, the last long-term leader, there were a few short-term leaders, but the last sort of 20-year leader of the Soviet Union. Brezhnev was in power in the 60s, 70s, and I think into the very early 1980s. And for the last several years of his tenure, he had demented. We didn't know that at the time because there was this sort of shroud of secrecy around. But after the fact, when the histories of the late Soviet Union were written, a lot of his officials came forward and said he just wasn't there for the last few years. He wasn't mentally there. And they worked around. They had structures that allowed them to work around. And one of the things that happened was he basically withdrew from public view. And presumably a second thing that happened, though we don't know, is that his control over nuclear weapons was probably sort of handed over to the generals. Ronald Reagan, too, in his second term in office, we now know was suffering from dementia, from Alzheimer's. And the same thing sort of happened. The staff rallied round, they protected him, they moved policy away from him, and they tried to limit the danger and the destruction of having a president who wasn't all there in charge of nuclear weapons and national security and everything else. And that's not happening with Donald Trump. So, let me go over a few things that have gone on just this past week, because things really are so extraordinary that I think they're worth. I do a column at the moment called Signal Noise for the Nation, where I try and separate out the stuff that's not important from the stuff that is important. And usually, I say, well, the tweets we should ignore. That's just noise. We should focus on the signal. In this instant, it seems to me the tweets and the public pronunciations are so extraordinary that they are the signal. Because what they're saying is, we are in a really perilous situation because we have a demagogue who is dementing. So, a few things. This week, the President of the United States, occupying the same exalted office that George Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, FDR, JFK, Obama, etc., have all occupied in the past, has used his platform to preen to the world about his quote-unquote great and unmatched wisdom. Now that would be a stupid thing to say even if it really was a good policy. It's a really stupid thing to say when he's talking about his great and unmatched wisdom and then putting in place one of the worst foreign policy decisions in American history. In that same tweet, he talked about totally destroying the economy of Turkey. And this is not the first, I think it's the third or fourth time he's talked about totally destroying another country. He's talked about it with North Korea, he's talked about it with Iran, he's talked about it with Venezuela, he's now talking about it with Turkey. Totally destroying another country is probably not something any human being ought to be boasting about, because it comes with a huge amount of human suffering. But Trump has no compunction about talking that way in public. Then, instead of totally destroying the Turkish economy, he basically green-lighted Turkey to go into the one part of Syria, this horrendous abattoir that's been this death zone for hundreds of thousands of people. The one part of Syria that was actually fairly functional and fairly democratic was the Kurdish enclave, which actually had democratic structures in place, actually protected women's rights, actually had some kind of semblance of political participation. And he green-lighted Erdogan to go in there and start a massacre. And then afterwards, he compounded the damage, I think it was yesterday or the day before, by saying he didn't care who went into Syria to help them. It could be the Russians, it could be the Iranians, or he said it could be Napoleon Bonaparte for all I care. This is extraordinary. This man green-lighted a massacre and then is saying, I don't care if somebody who's been dead for 200 years goes to help them, that's fine with me. He then gave a press conference with the Italian president, I believe, and talked about his quote-unquote strategic brilliance in a policy that, even as he was speaking, was leading to massacre, and that pretty much everybody across the political spectrum disagreed with. I mean, think of the feat he achieved, that he got Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Lindsey Graham to agree on anything. You know, this is completely amazing. It is politically brilliant in a way. I think, you know, you think it can't get worse. And then it does get worse. And I think the only way to understand it is that bullying and cruelty is now being superseded by bizarreness and crazy. And I've known a lot of people in my life who have begun dementing. And oftentimes what happens is they begin dementing and parts of their brain go first, and then they keep a muscle memory. I remember I saw a jazz musician a few years back, and she was in her late 80s, and she was really not there. You know, whenever she tried to talk, it didn't come out very well. But she still played the piano magnificently, because it was muscle memory. It was absolutely hardwired into her. And it seems to me that, unlike with Leonid Brezhnev or with Reagan as they began dementing, where they sort of faded slowly and quietly, unfortunately for us, Trump's muscle memory is demagoguery. And so the last thing to go is that ability to inflict pain, and that ability to gin up the mob, and that ability to create divisions between races or genders or classes. It's so hardwired into his personality, and it's so fundamental to who he is, that we're witnessing this completely catastrophic situation of the most powerful man on earth either dementing or having some kind of breakdown in full public view, and getting more loud and demagogic as he goes, and sending out these letters and these missives. They're quite simply extraordinary. I don't know if any of you saw the news today about this letter that he wrote a few days ago to Erdogan. And it was released, actually Fox Business was the first to report on it. I'm going to read you the whole thing because it is so utterly bizarre, and it is so impossible to imagine this comes with the presidential seal. Dear Mr. President, let's work out a good deal, exclamation point. You don't want to be responsible for slaughtering thousands of people, and I don't want to be responsible for destroying the Turkish economy. And I will. I've already given you a little sample with respect to Pastor Brunson. I've worked hard to solve some of your problems. Don't let the world down. You can make a great deal. History will look upon you favourably if you get this done the right and humane way. It will look upon you forever as the devil if good things don't happen. Don't be a tough guy. Don't be a fool, exclamation point. I will call you later. It makes no sense. And yet this is passing as official foreign policy in the year 2019 in the United States. Now, in most days, that would be far and away the biggest news story of the day, because it's completely excuse the French, but it's batshit crazy. I don't even think that made the top 5 today. Because in addition to that letter, you had the extraordinary spectacle of Trump basically throwing a temper tantrum at a meeting with the leaders in Congress from both political parties. You had him saying of his ex-defense secretary, a man who he desperately needs to stay silent, that he was the most overrated general, I think he said, in history, which is probably not the best way to get Mattis not to say the word. And then he said of Lindsey Graham, who has been his most reliably craven toady for the last year and a half or two at least, went on this huge tirade about how awful Lindsey Graham was. Well, he's right, Lindsey Graham is awful. But if you're trying to keep your political coalition intact and not get removed by the Senate, you probably don't want to tell Lindsey Graham that. And then, because it's still not over, I don't know if any of you have seen the news coverage of his statement that he made in the White House about why he was letting Syria and Russia have free reign in the Kurdish area. And it's the most bizarre thing, because he starts talking about Syria and he starts talking about Russia, and then he says, there's plenty of sand there for them to play in. And the stenographer looks up, and you have to watch this, because the stenographer, this lady, looks up, and she's like, sure. And then she looks down and starts scribbling again, and he keeps talking about playing in the sand. And he does this for about 20 seconds. He just keeps repeating how they have to play in the sand together. Now, here's the thing. McConnell at the moment is still running interference in the Senate. And he's still saying we can have this trial, we can get him acquitted, I'll be the great savior of the Republican Party, it'll all be over by Christmas. But here's the problem. Daily, hourly, Trump is showing himself not just to be a man who should be impeached, but he's showing himself to as a man who should be removed under the 25th Amendment's provisions. And he's showing himself as a man who ought to be as far away from the nuclear football as any human being on Earth. And I say this sort of slightly flippantly, but think of the moment we are in. That a man who any outside observer can see is losing his marbles has the power of life and death over every single person on this planet. The worst outcome of this whole thing would be if Donald Trump is impeached in the House and then McConnell arranges a completely fixed Senate hearing to guarantee his survival. Because at that point, Trump would have gone through every constitutional check and balance, and he would have shown the Congress to be utterly incapable of reining him in. And we know he has dictatorial instincts because he says so every day. The worst outcome would be if he feels empowered by a failed impeachment process. That's the terrifying thought. But I have to say, and I feel like ending on an optimistic note because, you know, what the hell. I've got to say, I think there is a growing possibility that Trump is going to prove so damaging and so delusional over the coming weeks that we're going to start seeing senators peeling away. Coming back to what I was saying about that cult of the personality, I really do think that when a cult of the personality starts to corrode, it does so very quickly. And I think it's entirely possible that all of those senators who have taken the insults and taken the humiliations and had to swallow their pride and had to look as their treasured policies on foreign policy and everything else were shredded, they're going to start not seeing the light, there's nothing moral about this, but they're going to start actually realizing just how destructive to the GOP's long-term survival prospects Trump now is. And they're going to start making a calculation. Yes, we have a primary base that is still largely loyal to Trump. That's the danger of going after him. But does Trump become so toxic that the second part of the calculation is, if we don't find a way to ditch him, we might get through the Republican primary, okay, but we are going to be so heavily punished by general election voters that it will destroy the GOP in the 2020 election. And that's where my optimism comes in, because it seems to me that unless Trump finds a way to shut up, unless somebody finds a way to disconnect his cell phone so he can't tweet in the middle of the night, he is incapable of reining himself in at this point. And half the time his words mean nothing, and half the time what they do mean is so terrifying that we wish they meant nothing. But I don't think Trump's going to come out of this intact. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if this unravels very quickly for them. And if at some point before the end of this year, Mitch McConnell finds a way to pull the plug on Donald Trump. That's the optimistic outlook. I don't know if I'm right or if I'm wrong, but it makes me sleep a little bit better at night. So I'm going to stop talking now. I'm going to open it up for questions, and I hope you have some questions to ask. I know you have one there. Yes.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Well, let's say that, as I say this, let's say that Trump is still in office after the presidential primaries are over, and then there's one Democratic nominee for president. So I've seen that Trump is really good at finding a vulnerability and then going into it. So what would you counsel the Democratic nominee for president? What would you tell them on how to protect themselves, from this amazing talent that Trump has for worming into the vulnerability?
Well, I'll be a bit careful about presuming to tell Democrats, what they should or shouldn't do, because, I'm sure they have a cadre of psychologists and everything else working with them on this. But in my opinion, very simple, go on the attack, because Trump thrives on weakness, and he thrives on people sort of stepping back a little bit. I would go on the attack, and I wouldn't stop once. I would just go after him and go after him and go after him, and I would absolutely refuse to let him take the initiative, because I think he thrives, as you said, in those sort of areas of weakness when a politician seems a little bit cautious or a little bit, moderate on an issue. I mean, I don't think Biden's a good candidate at all, but if Biden is the candidate, what he was saying, his catchphrase has been, I will beat him like a drum. And it's a cliche, but actually I think that's how you treat someone like Trump. You just go out there on stage, you're not going to get a proper debate with him, it's impossible. Go out there and beat him like a drum, and just make sure that everybody knows how sadistic he is, how irrational he is, how misogynistic he is, and so on. So that would be my advice, yeah.
So I saw in The Atlantic today, there was an article about Trump's relationship with some of the military higher-ups, the Pentagon, and how bad it was, which actually I was glad to read, because I guess my biggest nightmare is more that, so the good thing is that he would lose in the next election if he's still in office at that point, but then he refuses to leave.
That's my nightmare too.
Yeah.
Refuses to leave. So then he
That was
has
my
to be
nightmare.
removed, and probably he would need the
I mean,
army.
I've said actually to a lot of my friends on this when they've asked me this, that I have two criteria for who the Democratic nominee should be. And the first is who's going to present policies that I really, really like, rational, normal election kind of criteria. And the second criteria is who is already thinking about and has the stomach for that fight. Because I think you're absolutely right. Everything about Trump shows he's not going to leave power voluntarily. He's going to say there were, illegals voting. He's going to say that, there were irregularities. He's going to say that, whatever it is, he's going to make up one thing after another to find a way not to leave office, because he's fighting for personal survival. And this is the first time in presidential history where it's pretty clear that the minute he leaves office, he's going to be indicted. Even Nixon didn't face that. Mike
He was
Pence.
pardoned.
Well, he was pardoned by Ford, but Mike Pence can pardon Trump, and the minute he leaves office, New York is going to indict him, and there's nothing Mike Pence can do about that. So he really is fighting for his personal survival and his fortune. And it's like Citizen Kane, where there's that incredibly dirty gubernatorial election. He will do anything and everything to not leave office. So yeah, my second criteria is which of the Democratic candidates has the strength to stand up to a man who is trying to stay in office after losing an election. I don't think Biden has that. I don't see anything about him to suggest he has that fight. But your question about the military, I've been reading a lot about this, and you know, my reading, unless I'm sort of missing something, seems to be that the lower levels in the military have bought into Trumpism quite profoundly, but that the higher levels haven't. The generals, the officer corps does not like Trump and does not trust Trump. And I think, you know, that's something that's going to play out over the next few months. It's probably already playing out. I can't imagine they're remotely happy about what's happening in Syria because their honours at stake. And you know, I don't like
So
it.
could you, I mean, that could really devolve if he's the commander-in-chief, so who will the army follow, their commander-in-chief or their
It partly depends on
commanders?
how obviously irrational he's become, and this is why it seems to me that we should be having a conversation about the 25th Amendment. Not that any of his cabinet's likely to invoke it, they're not. I mean, I can't imagine, you know, Mike Espers or Bill Barr or, you know, any of these people actually standing up and saying, yes, our boss is insane. But it should be put into the public on a daily basis. We should be having this conversation that it's not normal to talk and act and send out tweets and letters of the kind that he's now sending out. And that when a man starts talking about sandpits, when he's talking about foreign policy, there's a thought process problem going on. That he's literally injecting random phrases into his speeches. And I think we should be having that conversation. I think psychologists should be out there, and geriatric specialists should be out there. There should be a conversation going on that deals with the mental health aspect as well as the criminal aspect. And I think that would give the military cover to, you know, what if he wakes up in the morning and says, I'm in a really bad mood, I'm going to order the firing of a nuclear weapon? There should be a military response saying, bad idea. You know, we're not going to do that. So that would be my answer to your question. I saw a hand somewhere there.
What about the 40% or more of people who have hung on to him, who have been indoctrinated by the right-wing pundits and radio, who really believe in deep state, who go along with him when he presents himself as someone who's beleaguered and unfairly treated, and who are fiercely opposed to Democrats, and I mean, so they don't have any allegiance to the Republican Congress. Republican Congress is afraid of them.
It's a huge problem. I'll say a few things on that. I think it's probably less than 40%. I think, you know, there's certainly 40% that instinctually will stay with him politically. I doubt that 40% of the country is as enmeshed in the sort of personality cult. You know, the ones who are very visible because they're the ones who wear the MAGA hats and they're the ones who go to these, you know, Nuremberg-style rallies and shout obscenities at immigrants. But those are tens of thousands, not tens of millions. You know, he has 65 million followers on Twitter, which is, you know, completely insane. But when he made that, you know, utterly bizarre tweet the other day about great and unmatched wisdom, I was following it, and within a few hours he had 148,000 likes. And I was completely stunned. I was like, you know, who are 148,000 people who read something that bizarre and click like on it? And then I thought about it more, and what that means is 64.8 million people who are following him actually took a break on that and didn't click like. And I think, you know, that's actually, you know...
The dog liked the tweet.
I think the hardcore is probably much smaller than the softcore. And I think that you're never going to get a you know, even in Russia today, there are diehards who still think Stalin was the greatest leader on earth. But the cult of the personality that meant that everybody in Russia supported him and that children wailed in their schools when he died, that's gone. And I think the same thing's happening here, that you're going to get a smaller and smaller hardcore. And I'm not saying they don't matter, they do, but I think it's going to more resemble a sort of European fascist party's support, where they get sort of 10 to 20% of the vote, but they can never form government.
But what about the issues they always bring up, which is he's anti-abortion, all of a sudden he is, and he's put the kind of judges we want in all of
and
the
that's
place,
McConnell's
you know?
calculation.
And so we're going to ignore all the rest of it because he's done these great two things that are our life and death.
No, and that's absolutely, you know, that is the McConnell calculation right there. I mean, McConnell must know what he's dealing with. McConnell, I don't like the man, but I don't think he's stupid. He must know how dangerous and delusional and cruel Trump is, but he's made a pact with him. He'll basically let Trump wallow in his own egoism in exchange for judges that suit the GOP base, in exchange for deregulation, and in exchange for tax cuts for businesses. That's the unholy bargain.
He'll get the same judges from Pence.
That's it. He would get this. So, at a certain point, it's a diminishing return because you do get the same judges with Pence. You might not get a viable electoral coalition for 2020, but for the next year anyway, you get the same judges. So that, at a certain point, McConnell's and other state GOP people at a certain point are going to say, we're not gaining enough from this unholy bargain to keep it going. And I think that's what's going to happen. Yeah.
We got time for maybe one or two more.
Let's do two more.
Given the president's willingness to do anything to protect himself and the fact that he alluded to civil war just a couple weeks ago in his tweets, do you think that there is a possibility that this dementing individual could call upon his cult-like supporters to go out in the streets and start violence to protect them?
Absolutely. There's no doubt from his public pronouncements that he would do that. So then the question comes back to what you were saying, where do the army and the other institutions of state fall on that? He's going to have a hard time calling out his supporters in any state where there's a Democratic governor because the National Guard will be called out instantly. I suspect he's going to have a hard time calling out his supporters in many Republican states as well, because I don't think there's that many state governors who want to go down as being the people who sparked a second civil war. I don't know, increasingly his presidency looks like a Confederate presidency. I don't know where the Old South would fall on that. I think you could get a situation where some of the more extremist Southern governors sided with Trump or even called out the National Guard to support Trump. I don't see how you get to a position where Trump wins militarily on the streets of the United States. I don't see that happening. But he's clearly hoping he can intimidate people into it. You had one question.
I did. So, you wrote a book called Jumping at Shadows, and it talks about like the irrational fears of people, and studies have shown that Republicans are Republicans because of their fear-based system. So they're not going to read your book or any books that actually help them or elucidate them. What can we do? Can you talk about some things that we can do as more rational people, I guess, to pull people in so that we don't have this, whatever happens after this, these are still people we have to live it with.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that really is going to be, as we try and unravel all of the damage of the last 4 years, this is going to be one of the great questions. How do we reestablish community? Some of it's media. We have got to find a way, and it's not just America, but the world's political systems have got to find a way to make social media accountable. Because the damage that's being done by the echo chambers and the spreading of, fake news is a stupid term, the spreading of lies, the spreading of just out and out fabrications. And, Mark Zuckerberg is so disgraceful in this. This idea that they're going to operate as the world's, essentially the world's largest media company, but with absolutely no editorial gatekeeping and no ability to say, you can't run this ad because it's flat out false. So I think number one, we have to find better systems of distributing information, because at the moment we've created really good systems for misinformation. The other thing is storytelling. And that sounds a bit wishy-washy, but if you sit down in a room of Republicans and you actually present them one-on-one, as opposed to an abstract concept, but one-on-one with an undocumented asylum seeker who's left Guatemala because they were starving or the gangs were threatening to kill them, and those people tell their stories. Again, you're not going to convince everybody. You're just not, but you start breaking down that sort of refusal to listen. And I really do think a lot of it is doing that hard work of storytelling. And I think where I'll end it is, I did a story for The Nation, not a column, a reported piece, last summer, about a year and a quarter ago, in North Carolina. And it was a group called Down Home North Carolina, and they basically were in very conservative Appalachian mountain counties in the west of the state. And they were knocking on doors, and they said to me, look, we have to do this, because if we don't do it, the alt-right is knocking on those same doors with a racial vision. And so they were knocking on doors and they were talking about community and solidarity and how to expand access to healthcare and how to expand access to opioid addiction treatments and how to expand access to affordable housing. And they were creating these intellectual coalitions. And they were doing it in 2 or 3 targeted counties, and they were impacting how people were voting. It was really interesting. There was just a measurable impact of that knocking on door and that speaking with people one-on-one. And I think, you know what, at the end of the day, that's how the civil rights movement worked. It's how people were canvassed for women's rights, for gay rights. None of this stuff happened by people just clicking on an emoji and saying like. It happened by legwork, by getting out into community. And I kind of believe that's where we're, you know, we want to heal from Donald Trump. We're going to have to knock on doors. We're going to have to talk to people in town squares and in meeting halls and churches and synagogues and mosques and everywhere else. And if we see that ground, really bad actors come into the vacuum. That's where I'm going to end it. Thank you.
So, Sasha, before you go, we aren't seeing you in the Sacramento Bee anymore, but can you tell people where they might see more of your writing and, you know, where to look for you?
You're not seeing me in the Sacramento Bee because the new opinion editor decided they didn't want locals writing about national issues because no one was interested in it. That's the backstory. Where you can see me, I am now doing a subscription-based weekly column, the Abramskyreport.com, so just theabramskyreport.com. Or you can see me twice a week in The Nation. It's called the Signal Noise column. Or you can see me in Truth Out, where I'm writing sort of once a week on either Brexit or America. So madness on either side of the Atlantic. And that's it. All right,
Great,
thank you.
thank you.